The Battle of Bull Run was the first major military engagement of the American Civil War. It was one of the messiest and one of the most sobering experiences in American military history. Its outcome shocked the American public and introduced it to the horrors of industrialized warfare. When Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers in April 1861, a militaristic fervor had swept across the country. Former political rivals started rallying around the president, and volunteers from across the northern states began to flock to Washington. The government until this point was coming off as indecisive, slow, even incompetent on some level. But now that violence was used against the government installation, the mood was changing. Lincoln had a clear cause around which he could rally both his supporters and his critics, put down the rebellion, preserve the Union. In the South, the response to Lincoln's call for volunteers was outrage. As I mentioned in the previous video, 4 states of the Upper South not only refused to send troops to answer Lincoln's call, but in a matter of weeks would join the Confederacy. This would bring the total number of seceded states to 11, which created major problems for the Union. This question is still debated, but in my opinion, the loss of the 4 Upper South states, particularly Virginia, would legitimately give the Confederacy a shot at surviving as a country. Of all the states that had seceded, the Upper South possessed the largest population, the greatest output of food, the biggest manufacturing capacity. Some of the most famous and talented military leaders of the South would be native Virginians. When a certain Colonel Robert E. Lee, you might have heard of him, was offered command of the Union armies by Lincoln's government, he refused, stating that he must first and foremost remain loyal to his native Virginia, and then promptly join the Confederates. Remember that name, because he'll be back. Even the capital of the Confederacy was moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. This would position the Confederate government uncomfortably close to Washington, and as a result, Virginia would become the constant battleground of some of the most grueling and bloody campaigns of the entire war. Even with the loss of the Upper South, on paper the situation still looked favorable for the Union. In terms of population, the North had up to 22 million people against the Confederacy's 9, and that number includes the 3.5 million slaves. The Union had some 110,000 manufacturing establishments to the Confederacy's 18,000. The Union enjoyed a far more extensive railroad network, a larger navy, and an already existing army, whereas the Confederacy would have to build one up from scratch. From that perspective, the Confederacy didn't seem to stand a chance against their northern brethren, and this contributed to the enthusiastic war fervor throughout the Union, with many hotheads expecting a quick and mostly painless victory. The reality, however, was a little less rosy and infinitely more complicated. While it was true that the North enjoyed a larger manpower advantage, keep in mind that the tremendous amount of slaves in the Confederacy could keep the economy afloat and allow a massive amount of white soldiers to be mobilized. Estimates vary, but it seems that throughout the war, the Confederates were able to mobilize as much as 80% of their fighting-age white males, a truly astonishing rate of mobilization. Then there was the actual size of the South. In order to win, the Union would have to conduct a military operation large enough to subdue 9 million people on an area stretching from Virginia in the north to Florida in the south and Texas in the west, all while facing a hostile population actively aiding the Confederate Army. Most battles would have to be fought in Confederate territory, meaning that Southern troops would be more likely to know how to use the terrain in their favor. The United States Army, in contrast, had never conducted an operation of this scale in its history, and while sheer resources were favoring the North, the actual war aims of the two sides arguably gave the Confederacy the edge. For instance, for the South, simply surviving as a country could be counted as a victory. By that metric, if the Union did nothing, the Confederates would win. If the two sides fought to a stalemate, the Confederates would win. If the Confederate Army could damage the invaders enough and convince the Union's population to stop supporting the war, the Confederacy would win. I may ruffle some feathers here, but I would go as far as to say that the Confederate States of America had a greater chance of surviving this war than the United States did at winning the American Revolution. By late May 1861, a substantial Union army began gathering outside of Washington. They had a head start, since the Union already possessed an active military prior to the war, but keep in mind that the US Army at this time was a far cry from the military juggernaut it is known as today. Numbering a mere 16,000 men prior to the war, Lincoln's initial call for 75,000 would be the biggest army ever mobilized in US history up to that point. The General-in-Chief of the Army was appointed to be the aging Winfield Scott. A man in his mid-70s, he was suffering from various ailments, weighed over 300 pounds, and had to take frequent naps which sometimes hindered his ability to command. Due to this decrepit physical appearance, he is often remembered as senile and useless as a commander, but in my opinion, that image is rather misleading. By his military reputation alone, Scott was an absolute rock star. His military service went back over 50 years. He was a distinguished veteran of the War of 1812, an absolute hero of the more recent Mexican-American War. In that particular conflict, he displayed exemplary leadership by conducting a swift campaign that resulted in the capture of Mexico City, which soon brought the war to an end. The famous general Arthur Wellesley had commented on Scott's leadership and named him, quote, the greatest soldier of the age. I'll emphasize that one more time. This is a commendation from the guy that literally defeated Napoleon in battle. So, whatever Scott's physical condition suggested about him, he seemed to be the only Union general with an actual long-term plan at defeating the Confederacy. His plan was to use the Union Navy to blockade the Confederate coastline, putting a heavy strain on its war economy. Meanwhile, a large Union army would move down the Mississippi River, securing the ports and military outposts along its coast. This would effectively cut the Confederacy in half, wrecking its economy and slowly choking it into surrender. While in hindsight Scott had underestimated the number of men and time this operation would require, he had actually quite accurately predicted how the rest of this war would be conducted. Before long, though, the Union press had caught wind of the plan, which they mockingly named the Anaconda Plan, and began enthusiastically writing about it in the newspapers, free for the Confederates to read about, of course. But both the public and the government, who clearly knew better than the actual military leaders, deemed the plan too passive and started putting pressure on the army to instead march directly on Richmond. But think about it from their perspective. Richmond was only some 100 miles away from Washington. It was there for the taking. Why bother with all this tedious planning and caution when you could march directly at the enemy capital, defeat their army, capture their government, and swiftly end the war while covering yourself in glory? In any democratic nation-state, public sentiment can have serious ramifications for elected officials and for military appointees, and Scott would be forced to give in to the pressure, as even President Lincoln had seemed convinced by the On to Richmond campaign. Scott's age, however, did affect his ability to physically lead the army, and though he remained in overall command, the actual field commander for the forces gathered outside Washington was appointed to be a certain Irvin McDowell. McDowell was an interesting choice in that he had never actually commanded troops in the field. A former staff officer, he was a large and somewhat quirky man with friends in high office. There are a lot of anecdotes surrounding his personality, but none of them actually have anything to do with his military ability, yet here he was, commanding the largest field army the United States had ever deployed in its history, urged on to bring the fight to the enemy. By July 1861, McDowell was made aware of Confederate troop movements and developed a plan to confront them. He fully understood that his army was still very green and required more training, but pressured by the government, he slowly left Washington on July 16th with an army of 35,000 men. A large Confederate force under General P.G.T. Beauregard was set to be stationed near Manassas Junction, numbering around 20,000 men. A vain man with a rich family background, Beauregard was trained at West Point and was, by all accounts, a very capable officer. In fact, he and McDowell used to be classmates at West Point, and as we will see throughout this conflict, former classmates facing each other in battle would become a tragic feature of the Civil War. Meanwhile, a second Confederate army under Joseph E. Johnston was operating nearby in the lower Shenandoah Valley and numbered around 8,000 men. Johnston was another graduate of West Point, a veteran of the Mexican-American War and a competent officer, though perhaps without the brilliance of the famous commanders we will later meet. Meanwhile, McDowell sets his ambitious plan into motion. He sends a significant force of 18,000 men under General Robert Patterson to engage Johnston and hold them in the valley at all costs. McDowell himself would then take his main force directly to attack Beauregard. The army would advance in 3 columns. 2 columns would engage Beauregard directly in the front, while a third would cross the Bull Run River further west and perform a flanking maneuver, overrunning Beauregard's left and collapsing his army. While this is a good plan on paper, it relies on speed, good organization, and excellent coordination between units that would have been difficult to pull off even with an experienced army. The Federal troops, on the other hand, after only a single day of marching, were already starting to look more like a disorganized mob. Soldiers openly disobey their officers and leave the marching column to raid local orchards and collect berries. The sweltering heat is slowing the army's march, and it takes an entire 2 days to finally get to Centerville, where McDowell sets up his headquarters. He then sends out a division under Daniel Tyler to scout out Confederate forces, but Tyler exceeds orders and blunders into a heavily defended position at Blackbird's Ford. The resulting skirmish leaves several dozen killed and wounded on both sides, and an irritated McDowell spends an entire 3 days redrawing his plans and scouting out enemy positions, while also alerting Confederate forces to the danger he was posing. Meanwhile, to the northwest, the flanking force under Robert Patterson that was meant to keep Johnston bogged down in the valley is facing its own troubles. Effective scouting and informants among the locals give away Patterson's movements, and even his own troops are threatening to go home as their 3-month enlistment period is almost up. Johnston, who was now aware of McDowell's presence in Centerville, then makes the risky decision to leave his position and bring his entire force to reinforce Beauregard, while Patterson, whose job it was to keep Johnston from leaving, seems completely convinced that he had succeeded in his mission and allows Johnston to slip away. With a certain Thomas Jackson in the lead, Johnston's forces are able to board trains at Piedmont Station and make their way to Manassas Junction, with most of their forces arriving by July 20th. Johnston and Beauregard then make their own plan to confront the Union Army. With their forces now combined, they decide to launch their own attack against McDowell, overrun his left flank, and defeat his army before Patterson could realize his mistake and send help. As morning arrives, however, McDowell sets his army into motion. He decides to use Daniel Tyler's division to attack the stone bridge as a distraction, while the main force would cross the Bull Run River at Sudley Springs to get around the Confederate army and flank it from the left in a surprise attack. At 5:15 a.m., Union artillery opens fire on Confederate positions near the Van Pelt farm, opening the battle. As Tyler's division advances towards the stone bridge, poor organization and the entangling of units is delaying the flanking columns. When they finally begin their crossing, by sheer mischance they are spotted by a Southern signal officer who immediately alerts the nearest Confederate brigade. Their commander, who suspected that the weak Union attacks along the river were merely a distraction, decides to act quickly and rushes his men to Matthews Hill to confront the new threat. Him and his 1,100 men have no idea they're about to come face to face with the full force of the entire Union attack. As fighting erupts on Matthews Hill, Beauregard is rather dismissive of this new development. Him and Johnston have been preparing their attack against the Union left and are convinced that the new threat is merely a distraction. Nevertheless, they send 2 brigades to reinforce their exposed left, which arrive just in time to slow the Union advance. More and more Federals are arriving on the battlefield, and the Confederate line is starting to crumble under the pressure. A Federal brigade under William T. Sherman makes an unexpected crossing at an unguarded ford and smashes in the Confederate flank, breaking the defenders and causing a panicked retreat. The broken defenders make their way to Henry House Hill, where they are met by Johnston and Beauregard, who finally understand the danger they were in and begin organizing a defense. They send forward Thomas Jackson with his Virginians, who brings up some 13 cannons and starts setting up a workable defensive line. General Barnard B., who attempts to regroup his retreating brigade, famously exclaims, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally on the Virginians!" Though whether he meant that as praise or criticism of Jackson remains unknown, as B is soon killed in the fighting. Nevertheless, for the rest of his life, Thomas Jackson would become known to all as Stonewall Jackson, and the legend of the Southern general is born in this moment. Meanwhile, McDowell fails to take advantage of his army's earlier success. Instead of building up momentum and keeping up the attack, he decides to pull back and regroup his forces, who are also shaken by the intensity of the fighting. Clouds of smoke floating over the battlefield make it difficult for the inexperienced officers to coordinate their men, and the similarity of the uniforms worn on both sides even cause instances of friendly fire. Attempting to regain momentum, artillery under Captains Griffin and Ricketts begin to bombard Confederate positions as the Federal infantry begin their push on Henry House Hill. Jackson, however, cleverly positioned his men and cannons on the reverse slope of the hill, thus shielding them from the worst of the Federal artillery. McDowell then makes a fateful decision. He orders Griffin and Ricketts' 11 cannons forward, abandoning their valuable positions on Dogan Ridge and setting up on the western slopes of Henry Hill. While this was supposed to provide better artillery support for the advancing Federal infantry, it had only exposed the cannons to intense fire from Jackson's defenders. A fierce artillery duel erupts, and in the confusion, Ricketts' battery opens fire on Henry House, where 85-year-old Judith Henry was hiding with her family. Her home is absolutely riddled with cannon fire, blowing off Judith's foot and inflicting multiple wounds on the poor woman. Tragically, she happened to be the first civilian casualty of the Civil War. As the assault on Henry House Hill intensifies, Griffin attempts to reposition some of his cannons to inflict flanking fire on the Confederates. His gunners soon spot infantry wearing blue uniforms advancing towards them. Mistaking them for reinforcements, the cannons hold fire until, to their horror, they realize too late the advancing infantry were in fact Virginians, confusingly dressed in blue. With cavalry support from a certain Jeb Stuart, they quickly overrun the cannons and scatter the Federal infantry protecting them. Spotting the opportunity, Jackson then launched a fierce attack on Ricketts' battery, and after a tough back and forth over the cannons, the battery falls into Confederate hands. As more Confederate reinforcements start showing up on the field, they enjoy even more success to the west as Federal forces are driven off of Chin Ridge. Beauregard then orders his entire line forward, and as Jackson tells his men to charge and yell like furies, the terrifying rebel yell floats across the battlefield for the first time. As the entire federal line begins to crumble, McDowell attempts to rally his men, but unable to stop the inevitable, he orders a retreat. Starting as an orderly withdrawal, the men are soon overwhelmed with panic, and with rumors of Confederate cavalry charging down their comrades, the federal retreat turns into a disorganized rout. Worse, the retreating soldiers become intermixed with a crowd of panicking civilians who had cynically arrived from Washington earlier to picnic and watch the battle. The Confederate army, however, is nearly as disorganized and exhausted in victory as the defeated Federals, and they make the controversial decision not to pursue McDowell. A decision that would later be heavily criticized by the Confederate government. But nevertheless, victory was in Confederate hands. While Bull Run is considered a mid-sized battle by later Civil War standards, at the time it was fought, it was the biggest battle in American history. It also marked the first time that trains were actively used to deliver soldiers to a battlefield, which directly affected its outcome. The Union suffered some 2,896 casualties, to the Confederates 1,982. A relatively low death toll compared to later Civil War battles, but it didn't seem that way at the time. The scale and the intensity of the fighting absolutely shocked the American public, especially in the North, as they expected a quick and easy victory. The outcome of the battle deeply affected morale, as Confederate troops were now filled with overblown self-worth, while Union soldiers would often be plagued with a certain anxiety when facing Confederate commanders in the Eastern theater of the war. Both sides, however, now realized that they were in for a long, drawn-out war, and with the gift of hindsight, we now know that they were about to enter the darkest chapter in American history. Thanks a lot for watching. More videos on the Civil War and other history topics are on their way, of course. These kind of videos take a long time to research and produce, so if you enjoyed this one and would like to support my channel, please remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and don't be shy to leave your comments, your criticisms, your suggestions down below. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Adieu.